The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck of the USS Enterprise as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey adjusted his flight goggles for what he believed might be his final mission. It was June 4th, 1942, and somewhere beyond the horizon lay the most powerful naval armada the Empire of Japan had ever assembled. What McCluskey didn't know was that in the next 72 hours, he would help deliver one of the most decisive defeats in naval history. 6 months had passed since the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of that surprise assault, was now orchestrating an even more ambitious plan. The Japanese combined fleet, consisting of over 160 ships, was converging on a tiny coral atoll called Midway. Yamamoto's strategy was elegant in its simplicity: capture Midway Island and draw the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle that would eliminate American naval power in the Pacific once and for all. But Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, held a secret weapon that Yamamoto couldn't have anticipated. Deep in the basement of Pearl Harbor, a team of cryptographers led by Commander Joseph Rockford had been working around the clock to break the Japanese naval code known as JN-25. Through painstaking analysis of intercepted radio transmissions, they had uncovered the details of Yamamoto's plan, including the exact timing and location of the attack. The intelligence was so precise that Nimitz knew the Japanese would strike Midway at dawn on June 4th. More importantly, he knew the composition of the enemy force for aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu protected by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. It was a formidable armada, but Nimitz had something Yamamoto lacked: the element of surprise. As reported in contemporary accounts from naval historians, the American forces at Midway were significantly outnumbered, with only 3 operational aircraft carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, at Yorktown against Japan's 4. The USS Yorktown had been so badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just a month earlier that it should have required 3 months of repairs. Instead, Pearl Harbor shipyard workers had performed a miracle, patching her up in just 72 hours. Captain Elliot Buckmaster stood on Yorktown's bridge, knowing his ship was held together by little more than steel patches and determination. The carrier's elevators still bore the scars of bomb damage, and her flight deck had been hastily repaired with concrete and wooden planks. Yet here she was, steaming toward what would become the most crucial naval engagement of the Pacific War. The Japanese were confident of victory. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, had led the successful attack on Pearl Harbor and had since carved a path of destruction across the Pacific. His pilots were among the most experienced in the world, veterans of campaigns in China and the early Pacific battles. They had never known defeat. As the sun set on June 3rd, both fleets moved through the darkness toward their fateful encounter. On the Japanese carriers, pilots slept soundly, dreaming of another easy victory. On the American ships, men wrote letters home that weren't sure would ever be delivered. The stage was set for a battle that would determine whether the rising sun would continue its dominance over the Pacific, or whether the tide of war would finally turn in America's favor. The first light of June 4th, 1942, brought with it the thunder of aircraft engines as 108 Japanese planes lifted off from their carriers, bound for Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the strike force, his K-torpedo bomber heavy with ordnance as it climbed into the morning sky. Behind him, Val-dive bombers and Zero fighters formed up in perfect formation, their rising sun insignias gleaming in the dawn light. At exactly 6:30 a.m., the Japanese strike force appeared over Midway like a swarm of angry hornets. The small garrison on the island, consisting of Marines, Navy personnel, and a handful of Army Air Force pilots, had been alerted by radar operators who had detected the incoming raid. While it was still 150 miles away, every available aircraft on Midway outdated Brewster Buffaloes, a few Wildcats, and some ancient Vindicators had already taken to the air. Major Floyd Parks, leading a squadron of Marine fighters and obsolete Buffalo aircraft, knew he was flying to his death. The Japanese Zeros were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots with years of combat experience. But Parks and his men climbed toward the enemy formation anyway, determined to sell their lives dearly. The ensuing air battle was a massacre. Within minutes, 15 of the 26 American fighters had been shot down, Parks among them. On Midway itself, the bombing was devastating but not decisive. Tominaga's bombers struck fuel depots, the power plant, and the airfield, sending columns of black smoke into the morning sky. Buildings collapsed and men died in the explosions, but the island's critical infrastructure remained largely intact. More importantly, Midway's runways, though damaged, were still operational. Meanwhile, 150 miles to the northeast, Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the USS Enterprise was making the most important decision of his career. Intelligence had placed the Japanese carriers approximately 200 miles southwest of Midway, just at the extreme range of his aircraft. Conventional wisdom dictated waiting until the enemy came closer, but Spruance understood that surprise was his only advantage against a superior force. At 7:45 a.m., Spruance gave the order that would change the course of the Pacific War, launch the attack. Within minutes, the decks of Enterprise and Hornet erupted in controlled chaos as dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters roared into the sky. The Yorktown, still bearing her battle scars, followed suit 30 minutes later. The American strike force was a mixed bag of aircraft and pilots. Many of the torpedo plane crews had never flown in combat before, and their Douglas TBD Devastators were slow, obsolete aircraft that the Japanese had already proven vulnerable at the Battle of the Coral Sea. The dive bomber pilots were more experienced, flying the newer SBD Dauntless, but they faced the daunting task of finding and attacking the most heavily defended fleet in the Pacific. As documented in official Navy records from the period, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, knew his outdated Devastators were flying into a death trap. Before takeoff, he had told his men, "If we don't come back, none of us need feel ashamed." His words would prove prophetic. Back on the Japanese carriers, Admiral Nagumo faced a critical decision. Tominaga had radioed from over Midway that a second attack on the island would be necessary to completely neutralize its defenses. But Nagumo also had reports of American ships in the area. Should he rearm his remaining aircraft with land attack bombs for a second strike on Midway, or should he prepare for a naval engagement? Nagumo chose to hedge his bets, ordering his planes rearmed with land attack ordnance while keeping some aircraft ready for anti-ship operations. It was a decision that would cost him precious time he could not afford to lose. At 9:20 a.m., the first American attack found the Japanese fleet. Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8, flying without fighter escort after becoming separated from the other squadrons, approached the Japanese carriers at low altitude. The Zero Combat Air Patrol fell on them like wolves, one by one. The lumbering Devastators were shot down, their crews dying in flames as they crashed into the Pacific. Only one man from the entire 15-plane squadron survived. The waters around the Japanese fleet became a graveyard of American aircraft as wave after wave of attacks failed to penetrate the enemy's defenses. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay's Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise met the same fate as Waldron's squadron, with only 4 of 14 aircraft surviving the encounter with the Zero fighters and the wall of anti-aircraft fire thrown up by the Japanese fleet. The scene aboard the Japanese carriers was one of controlled confidence. Admiral Nagumo and his staff watched from the bridge of the Akagi as American planes fell burning into the sea. The torpedo attacks had been beaten off without a single hit, and Japanese damage control teams were efficiently clearing the decks and preparing for the next phase of operations. Below decks, ordnance crews worked feverishly to rearm aircraft with the proper weapons for their next mission, switching from land attack bombs back to armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for anti-ship work. Captain Buckmaster aboard the Yorktown was preparing his ship for the inevitable counterattack when lookouts spotted the incoming Japanese strike. The Hiryu's planes were approaching from the southwest, flying low over the water to avoid detection. Air raid sirens began wailing across the American fleet as fighters scrambled to intercept the enemy formation. The most decisive 5 minutes in naval history had passed, but the Battle of Midway was entering its most dangerous phase. The Japanese, though bloodied, still possessed the means to strike back, and Admiral Yamaguchi was determined to prove that the samurai spirit could overcome any material disadvantage. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the burning hulks of the Japanese carriers as the Hiryu, alone and defiant, prepared to strike back at the American fleet. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, known throughout the Japanese Navy for his aggressive tactics and unwavering determination, stood on his flagship's bridge with the calm demeanor of a samurai preparing for his final battle. At 11:58 a.m., Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero escorts off the Hiryu's deck, there to target the American task force that had just delivered such devastating blows to the combined fleet. These pilots, like their fallen comrades, were among Japan's elite naval aviators. Men who had trained for years to reach this level of skill and dedication aboard the USS Yorktown. Radar operators detected the incoming strike while it was still 46 miles away. Captain Buckmaster immediately ordered general quarters, and the carrier began launching every available fighter to intercept the Japanese formation. The Yorktown's F-4F Wildcats, though outnumbered and outclassed by the Japanese Zeros, climbed toward the enemy with grim determination. The air battle that followed was a brutal affair. Fought at high speed and low altitude over the blue waters of the Pacific, American pilots, many of whom had never seen combat before this morning, threw themselves against the experienced Japanese airmen with desperate courage. Several Val dive bombers were shot down before they could begin their attack runs, but Kobayashi and his surviving pilots pressed on toward their target. At 12:10 p.m., the remaining Japanese dive bombers rolled into their attacks on the Yorktown. The carrier's anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with exploding shells and tracers, creating a deadly curtain of fire that the Japanese pilots had to penetrate. The second bomb hit further aft, destroying the radar room and killing all personnel inside. The third bomb penetrated near the island's superstructure, causing extensive damage to the ship's communications equipment. As recorded in damage control reports from the battle, the Yorktown's crew responded to the crisis with remarkable efficiency and courage. Damage control parties rushed to contain the fires, while medical teams worked to evacuate the wounded. Within an hour, the carrier's flight deck had been repaired sufficiently to resume air operations, a testament to American naval engineering and training. But Admiral Yamaguchi was not finished. At 1:30 p.m., he launched a second strike, 10K torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros under the command of Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same pilot who had led the morning attack on Midway Island. Tominaga's plane had been damaged in that earlier mission and his fuel tank had been punctured, but he volunteered to lead this final assault knowing he would not have enough fuel to return. The second Japanese attack approached the American fleet from a different direction, forcing the defending fighters to split their attention. Despite the valiant efforts of the American pilots, several torpedo planes broke through the defensive screen. Lieutenant Tominaga, flying with a fuel tank that was steadily leaking gasoline, led his remaining aircraft in a low-level attack on the Yorktown. The carrier, still recovering from the earlier bomb damage, was caught at a disadvantage. The Type 91 aerial torpedoes struck the ship's port side, causing massive flooding and a severe list that threatened to capsize the vessel. Captain Buckmaster, recognizing that his ship was in mortal danger, gave the order to abandon ship at 2:55 p.m. The sight of the Yorktown listing heavily and apparently sinking sent a wave of satisfaction through the Japanese survivors. From the bridge of a rescue destroyer, Admiral Naguma watched the American carrier's apparent death throes with grim pleasure. Perhaps the tide of battle was turning after all. But even as the Yorktown fought for her life, American search planes were scouring the Pacific for the Hiryu. At 2:45 p.m., Lieutenant Samuel Adams, flying a scout bomber from the Enterprise, spotted the lone Japanese carrier steaming northeast at high speed. Adams immediately radioed the position to Admiral Spruance, who ordered an immediate strike against this final threat. The Dragon was about to face the full fury of American naval aviation, and this time there would be no reprieve. The climactic phase of the Battle of Midway was about to begin, and with it, the final act in the drama that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. At 3:30 p.m. on June 4th, 1942, 24 SPD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher, climbed toward their rendezvous with destiny. Their target was the Hiryu, the last operational Japanese aircraft carrier, steaming desperately northward in a futile attempt to escape the retribution that was about to fall upon her. Admiral Yamaguchi, aboard the Hiryu, knew his situation was hopeless. His two strikes against the American fleet had expended most of his available aircraft, and he had no fighter cover to protect his ship from the inevitable counterattack. Still, the Samurai Code demanded that he face his fate with dignity and courage. He ordered his remaining crew to prepare for their final battle. At 5:15 p.m., Gallagher's dive bombers appeared over the Japanese fleet like harbingers of doom. The Hiryu's anti-aircraft guns opened fire immediately, filling the sky with bursting shells and tracer rounds. But there were too few guns and too many American planes. The outcome was never in doubt. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher selected the Hiryu as his personal target, rolling his Dauntless into a steep dive from 14,000 feet. Behind him, 23 other American pilots followed suit, their bomb bay doors opening as they screamed down toward the enemy flight deck. The Japanese gunners, brave to the end, continued firing even as the American bombs fell among them. The second bomb hit near the forward elevator, causing massive structural damage and starting uncontrollable fires. A third bomb struck aft, near the ship's island, destroying the bridge and killing most of the senior officers stationed there. Admiral Yamaguchi, one of the few senior officers to survive the initial bombing, surveyed the destruction with the calm acceptance of a warrior who had always known this day would come. His flagship was dying, and with her would die the last hope of Japanese victory at Midway. As documented in Japanese naval records recovered after the war, Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship rather than accept rescue. "I am responsible for the loss of Hiryu and the death of her crew," he reportedly told his staff officers. "I will not survive this disgrace." At dawn on June 5th, the Hiryu finally succumbed to her wounds and slipped beneath the Pacific waves, taking Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku with her. Meanwhile, the Yorktown, which had been given up for dead earlier in the day, was staging a remarkable comeback. Damage control parties had managed to correct her list and restore power to critical systems. By evening, the carrier was under tow by the destroyer USS Hammond, and there was hope that she might be saved. But the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been stalking the damaged carrier since late afternoon. At 6:15 a.m. on June 6th, Tanabe fired a spread of 4 torpedoes at the Yorktown and her escorts. 2 torpedoes struck the carrier, causing fatal flooding, while a third hit the Hammond, breaking the destroyer in half and killing 81 sailors. The loss of the Yorktown was a tragedy, but it could not diminish the magnitude of the American victory, and for days of fighting, the Japanese had lost 4 aircraft carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and over 3,000 men, including many of their most experienced pilots. The American losses, while significant, were far less: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and just over 300 casualties. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving reports of the disaster from his flagship, the super battleship Yamato, made the painful decision to cancel the Midway operation and withdraw his surviving forces. The man who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor now faced the reality that his gamble had failed catastrophically. The Japanese Navy, which had seemed invincible just days earlier, was now in full retreat. The strategic implications of the defeat were immediately apparent to both sides. Japan had lost not just ships and planes, but the initiative in the Pacific War. Never again would the Japanese Navy possess the strength to mount major offensive operations. The tide of war had turned, and it would flow inexorably toward the Japanese home islands for the next 3 years. As the sun set on June 6, 1942, the Battle of Midway came to an end. In the space of 4 days, the course of World War II in the Pacific had been fundamentally altered. The sleeping giant that Admiral Yamamoto had feared to awaken was now fully roused, and it would not rest until the rising sun had set forever on the Japanese Empire. 6 months after the Battle of Midway, Admiral Chester Nimitz stood on the bridge of the USS South Dakota as she steamed through the waters where the greatest naval battle in history had been fought. The ocean showed no signs of the carnage that had occurred here, but the strategic landscape of the Pacific War had been forever changed. By those for crucial days in June, the victory at Midway had provided the United States with something it desperately needed: time. Time to build new ships, train new pilots, and marshal the industrial might that would eventually overwhelm the Japanese Empire. By December 1942, American shipyards were launching more aircraft carriers in a month than Japan could build in a year. The production battle was being won as decisively as the battle itself had been, but the human cost of victory could not be forgotten. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron and the third of 4 other members of Torpedo Squadron 8, who had sacrificed their lives in the opening phase of the battle, were posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. Their heroic attacks, though tactically unsuccessful, had contributed directly to the American victory by drawing down the Japanese fighter cover and disrupting enemy operations. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, had spent 30 hours floating in the Pacific after his aircraft was shot down, hiding under a sea cushion while the battle raged overhead. He was eventually rescued by a patrol plane and lived to tell the story of his squadron's sacrifice. "We knew we were going to die," he later recalled, "but we also knew that our deaths might help win the war." The Japanese, meanwhile, struggled to come to terms with their defeat. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their experienced aircrew created a gap in Japanese naval aviation that could never be filled. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of both Pearl Harbor and the Midway disaster, privately acknowledged that Japan's chances of winning the war had evaporated along with his. Carrier fleet. Contemporary analysis by military historians, as documented in post-war studies, reveals that Midway marked the beginning of a fundamental shift in naval warfare. The battle demonstrated conclusively that aircraft carriers, not battleships, were now the decisive weapons of naval combat. Admiral Yamamoto's mighty Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, had played no role in the fighting. While relatively small dive bombers had changed the course of history, the intelligence breakthrough that had made the victory possible also had lasting consequences. The American ability to read Japanese naval codes continued throughout the war, providing crucial advantages in subsequent battles. Admiral Nimitz would later say that the victory at Midway was essentially a victory of intelligence, crediting the codebreakers who had given him the advantage of knowing his enemy's plans. For the Japanese Empire, Midway represented the high water mark of their Pacific expansion. Never again would Japanese forces advance so far from their home islands. The defeat marked the beginning of a long, bloody retreat that would end 3 years later with the surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose decision to follow the destroyer Arashi had led the American dive bombers to their targets, was awarded the Navy Cross for his role in the victory. He continued to serve throughout the war, eventually retiring as a rear admiral. "We were just doing our job," he would say years later, displaying the modest heroism that characterized the greatest generation. The Battle of Midway had lasted for days, but its effects would be felt for decades to come. It marked the moment when American industrial and military power began to assert itself in the Pacific, transforming the United States from a nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor into the dominant force in the Pacific theater. As Admiral Nimitz concluded his inspection tour of the battle site, he reflected on the words of Admiral Yamamoto, spoken before the attack on Pearl Harbor. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." At Midway, that sleeping giant had flexed its muscles for the first time, and the world had witnessed the beginning of the end of the Japanese Empire. The young men who had flown their aircraft into the face of certain death over the waters of Midway had not just won a battle, they had changed the course of history itself. Their sacrifice had ensured that freedom would ultimately triumph over tyranny, that democracy would survive the greatest threat it had ever faced. The Battle of Midway was over, but its legacy would endure forever as a testament to courage, sacrifice, and the power of free people to defend their way of life against any enemy, no matter how powerful or determined. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu allowed himself a moment of satisfaction as he watched the last of the American torpedo planes disappear beneath the waves. His carrier, one of the most modern in the Japanese fleet, had emerged unscathed from the morning's attacks. The Americans, he thought, were brave but foolish, throwing away their aircraft and their lives in futile gestures against the superior Japanese force. But the American attacks, though seemingly futile, were achieving something crucial that the Japanese commanders failed to recognize. Each successive wave of torpedo planes had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, forcing the Zero fighters to expend fuel and ammunition in low-altitude combat. More importantly, the constant attacks had prevented the Japanese from launching their own strikes against the American carriers. At 10:20 a.m., as the last of the torpedo planes were being shot down, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey was flying 160 miles from the Japanese fleet in his SPD Dauntless dive bomber, leading 37 aircraft from Enterprise's bombing and scouting squadrons. McCluskey had been searching for the enemy carriers for over 2 hours, his fuel running dangerously low, when he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer speeding northeast. The destroyer was the Arashi, which had been detached from the main fleet to hunt down and sink the American submarine USS Nautilus. McCluskey made a crucial decision to follow the destroyer's wake, correctly reasoning that it would lead him back to the Japanese fleet. His intuition would prove to be one of the most important tactical decisions of the war. Contemporary military analysis, as recorded in post-war interviews with surviving participants, reveals that the timing of McCluskey's arrival was perfect. The Japanese carriers had just completed recovering their combat air patrol and were in the process of rearming and refueling their aircraft for strikes against the American fleet. The flight decks were crowded with planes, fuel lines were running across the decks, and ordnance was stacked everywhere. At 10:22 a.m., McCluskey's dive bombers appeared over the Japanese fleet like avenging angels. The Zero fighters that had been so effective against the low-flying torpedo planes were now caught at sea level. Unable to climb quickly enough to intercept the American dive bombers attacking from 14,000 feet, attack, McCluskey radioed, and 37 SBD Dauntlesses rolled into their dives, screaming down toward the Japanese carriers at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour. The Japanese anti-aircraft gunners, who had been tracking targets at sea level for the past hour, struggled to elevate their weapons quickly enough to engage the diving bombers. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading the bombing squadron from Enterprise, selected the Akagi as his target. At the same time, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie was leading 17 dive bombers from the Yorktown toward the same target area. Due to a navigation error, both American squadrons had arrived over the Japanese fleet simultaneously, creating a concentration of firepower that no defense could withstand. The sacrifice of the torpedo plane crews had not been in vain. Their heroic attacks had created the conditions for this moment when American dive bombers would have a clear shot. At the heart of the Japanese fleet, the fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance, as dozens of American bombs fell toward their targets, carrying with them the hopes of a nation and the dreams of free peoples everywhere. At exactly 10:24 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the first American bomb struck the flight deck of the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi. With a thunderous explosion that could be heard for miles across the Pacific, the explosion triggered a chain reaction of secondary blasts as aviation fuel ignited and ordnance cooked off. Within seconds, the pride of the Japanese fleet was transformed into a raging inferno. Admiral Nagumo, standing on the bridge, watched in horror as flames engulfed his flagship. The carrier that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor was now dying beneath his feet. The first bomb hit forward of the superstructure, the second struck amidships near the flight deck island, and the third penetrated near the forward elevator. Like the Akagi, the Kaga's hangar decks were packed with armed and fueled aircraft, creating a deadly combination that turned the ship into a massive bomb. Commander Takahisa Amagai, the Kaga's air officer, was on the flight deck when the first bomb hit. The blast threw him against the gun mount, breaking several ribs, but he survived long enough to witness the destruction of his ship. The flight deck was a sea of flames. He would later recall, aircraft were exploding one after another, and men were jumping into the sea to escape the fires. The Soryu, attempting to evade the American attack, was struck by 3 bombs from Lieutenant Best's squadron. The bombs hit in rapid succession, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the hangar spaces below. Captain Yanamoto, who had felt so confident just minutes earlier, now found his ship listing heavily to starboard as uncontrolled fire spread throughout the vessel. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's fleet carriers had been reduced to burning wrecks. The cream of Japanese naval aviation experienced pilots, who had taken years to train, were trapped below decks or died in the flames that consumed their aircraft. It was a catastrophe of unprecedented magnitude for the Japanese Navy, as documented in official Japanese naval records recovered after the war. The loss was not merely material, but psychological. These carriers represented the heart of Japanese naval power, the instruments of their early victories in the Pacific. Their destruction in such a brief span of time shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility and marked the beginning of the end of their Pacific empire. Admiral Nagumo, his face blackened by smoke and his uniform singed by fire, was forced to abandon his flagship as sailors helped him down a rope ladder to a waiting destroyer. He could see the funeral pyres of his 3 carriers stretching across the horizon. The man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor was now presiding over the greatest naval disaster in Japanese history. But the battle was far from over. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, had been separated from the main force and had escaped the devastating American attack. Rear Admiral Tama Yamaguchi, commanding the Hiryu, was determined to exact revenge for the destruction of his comrades. At 10:50 a.m., he launched 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters toward the American fleet. Meanwhile, aboard the American carriers, jubilation mixed with exhaustion as the dive bomber crews returned from their successful mission. Many aircraft landed with empty fuel tanks, their pilots having pushed their luck to the very limit. Wade McCluskey's Dauntless had been shot full of holes by Japanese fighters, and his gunner had been wounded, but they had lived to see the greatest naval victory in American history. Admiral Spruance, receiving reports of the successful attacks, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before turning his attention to the next phase of the battle. 3 Japanese carriers were burning, but intelligence indicated that at least 1 remained operational. The job was not finished, and the Japanese were not known for giving up easily.